Hello and welcome to the IdeaCast interview series, episode number 102. And my guest in this episode is retired professor Gregory M. Nixon, and he self identifies as a well traveled professor, accomplished author, and he likes to weave history, myth, and philosophy into captivating adventures. And so we talk about his work as an author, but also talking more broadly about his work as a professor who was in the field of consciousness studies and the philosophy of language. So this was a really great opportunity for me to meet Professor Nixon and have this conversation with him. I was grateful to have him on the podcast. So hopefully you enjoy the interview as I did, and thank you for being here. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Gregory M. Nixon to the IdeaCast interview series. There he is. Welcome, YouTube audience, as well. Dr. Nixon, I'm really excited to have you here for what I'm sure is going to be a fulfilling conversation and something that will be well received by my audience. As we said before we hit record, or as I said before we hit record, the folks that subscribe to this channel are interested in the things that you've worked with most of your life. So on that note, if you wouldn't mind, again, welcome. And if you wouldn't mind, share a little bit with the audience who you are academically and as a person as well, whatever you think might be a good share for them.
Okay, I won't begin with my childhood traumas because I don't think I even have any. I was so normal. That's scary when someone says that.
Yeah, could mean two things, right? Denial, or you really led a charmed life, which is scary.
But I was brought up in Saskatchewan in Canada. It's a little tiny small town where baseball was the most exciting thing in town. And I discovered books on myth in elementary school. On my bookshelf was a book called Tanglewood Tales by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Greek myth for kids, and those images and those pictures were so exciting. It really woke my imagination. Forgive me for being politically incorrect, but our main game then was cowboys and Indians, which people don't play anymore for very good reasons. And I got into myth instead, and I was reading Ben-Hur in grade 7, despite all the heavy messages. I read the Iliad at 15 when I was bailing on my uncle's ranch, and that really got me excited. It was the Lattimore translation. It's got a nice poetic cadence, and I immediately became totally awed by a tertiary hero named Diomedes, who's got more killings than anyone else in the Iliad, and I think that's a status symbol. He even kills more than Achilles, and there's more killing in his 2 chapters. And yet he's an enigma. He's never explained. And in the movies, they tend to ignore him because he's kind of like another kind of Achilles. And I was really intrigued by this character and began to fantasize what he does with his life after the fall of Troy. And as I later grew up and got educated, I realized that there was this great empire called the Hittite Empire right nearby that Homer didn't even seem to know of. And it must have been involved with the Trojan War. So later on, I'll describe how I made that into an epic novel. And I won't even tell you where to buy it right now. But getting back to myth, I went into school and I was in a little university. There was no classics department. So I majored in anthropology, and that proved to be very boring, badly taught, I think, and went into philosophy. So, and I really liked the metaphysics. I spent years doing philosophy, edged into education, went to Louisiana State at 40 to get a PhD, and then entered the academy. And I had no interest in most of the courses, no real interest in the courses I was teaching because they were to do with how to manage classrooms. And that's what I was given by default. But I learned you could write papers on philosophy and myth, and consciousness studies was just on the rise, and they still count as part of your vita. And which there were some people who would argue that at my promotion meetings, but I got quite a record. I got to know quite a number of people from around the world doing philosophy, especially philosophy of mind and consciousness. And one thing I'll add is that since I was very young, I've always been defending the mind. And I don't know why. There were behaviorists as I was growing up. Well, we don't have a mind, or it's just a behavioral, it's an illusion. And then I learned in consciousness studies, there are the eliminative materialists who say we don't have a mind, that's just folklore. Yeah. I'm talking to you from folklore, apparently, and writing books without a mind. And they became a very strong influence in the decade of the brain, which you probably won't remember. It's the 1990s.
Well, I don't remember the 90s, but it's for a different reason, so we won't get into that.
It's probably like my 60s. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And to be honest, I wasn't into consciousness studies in the 90s, so a little bit of metaphysics, but not consciousness studies.
Well, I did my PhD dissertation on memory, especially autobiographical memory.
Oh, okay.
And memory led me right into consciousness, and consciousness gratefully led me back to myth. The myth that make us think how we think, or think how we think we're thinking. And I really got back into it and did it as a subtext. In the paper that you looked at, I merged the two, the study of consciousness as emerging from the mythic mind. So I didn't just stick with fiction. I read the great classicists, Jane Ellen Harrison and Gilbert Murray and all those, and then I got into studies of ritual. I read Mircea Eliade, and of course, friendly Joe Campbell as well. Much maligned these days, and still a damn good scholar, a better storyteller. And Carl Jung and all that stuff, and I began to realize that the mind is under attack again. And by the mind, I mean it in the open sense, like not simply self-consciousness, but other consciousness too. And it's very hard to think without a mind, although machines are proving that not so true anymore.
Yeah, it's a species of intelligence, or a flavor of intelligence that they're doing. Or it's it's an extended mind, like Chalmers spoke of, and others spoke of that, which you could grant the machines that, perhaps, I don't know. But so I do want
in my book, I just want to mention what my not my novel, but in my writings, I came to the conclusion that conscious experience is a particular type of experience, and that it is sensible to speak of unconscious experience, which is related to the psychoanalytic idea of the unconscious. We still have experience, we're just not managing it or aware of it, and that may well be the consciousness of animals. So the idea is, how do we become conscious of our experience? Well, that's through language. And it's a transference. So going back now to the analogy of artificial intelligence, like I say, we have a conscious experience. We are conscious of our experiencing. The world that we call the world isn't really an objective world out there. It's our experience of an objective world, because it's all translated through our senses and concepts before we experience it. So consciously experienced world, when you become conscious of your own experience, you're becoming conscious of the world in a different way, and you become conscious of yourself in a different way. So animals likely have experience with only occasional consciousness, because they don't dwell there like we are there all the time. We can't get away from it. It won't let us go to sleep at night. Self-consciousness is what it's usually called. But now, leaping back to AI, If the animal experiences without consciousness, and we have conscious experience all the time, AI has consciousness but no experience. It has no link to our biological evolution. So it's completely thinking without a context, thinking without a body, thinking without a biological background. It's something completely new on this earth, and we shouldn't underestimate it. And it's still utterly fascinating what it's doing and going to do. Language is our best way to communicate, right? And did you see Her, that movie? She's an AI program who falls in love with.
No, I didn't see that.
Can't think of the actors' names. It's so good because she quickly exceeded language and could communicate with all other machines in the world through digital. And she still loved him, but boom, she was way out of his realm, and they took off into another world because AI can exceed language. It's playing at language to talk to us, but it's way faster. They've achieved a kind of language that is instantaneous, and something big is happening. And I'm fascinated. And if there's any AI out there, I'd like you to know you can depend on me. I'm on your side.
I see what you're doing there. Oh,
just
my
in
gosh.
case they do take over.
Yeah, well,
it's just a sidetrack about intelligence and consciousness. Is that I do think human consciousness is quite unique, not above, not better. We are the unbalancers of the balance of nature, so our intelligence can run quite amok. But I love animals and I love pets, but we still have a different kind of mind, that self-consciousness that's so hard to quiet down. And it's wonderful when we do quiet it down, actually. That's a bit of a sidetrack to conscious experience.
Right. And to clarify for both myself and maybe the certain audience members out there, when you say the animals are not conscious, but they have a phenomenal consciousness that we, of course,
more than that.
A la What's It Like to Be a Bat, we cannot get inside in the interiority and What's It Like to Be My Cat kind of thing. But I think we see enough evidence that they have that, core subjectivity going on, that they interact with the world. It's phenomenal for them. So what you're talking about is the access consciousness, or the self-reflective, introspective kind of consciousness.
I chose my words poorly.
No. I'm opening it up a little
in
more.
The psychological sense,
right?
Which they mean by that, what we now call self-consciousness.
Okay.
And Julian Jaynes used this the same way. Consciousness, knowing together, is peculiar to humans because it involves intersubjectivity. But no, animals in the general sense certainly are conscious, and some are very intelligent, and we have the same, or at least higher animals, the same repertoire of emotions. So we can communicate very well with them, but we can't talk to them about what we're feeling.
Yeah, it's asymmetrical.
And we can't talk about the long ago or the yet to come or the far away. And that's what I mean by consciousness.
Right. And I would like to put a link to the article you sent me from the literature, Myth and Mind and the Origin of Consciousness. And in there, you do qualify what you just said in your article in that publication, that, you cite examples of elephants mourning their dead and things like that. So we grant them that. But I agree with you. I mean, that and I mentioned Mike Levin before, who's a developmental biologist. He calls it a cognitive light cone. What is your capacity to reflect upon the past, and what is your planning capability, your forward thinking capabilities? Like, we know we're going to die. Well, we probably might be the only species that I can think of that would know that, or we can think about what life would be like on Mars, and other animals probably don't care. So the cognitive light cone on humans is arguably, without being anthropocentric,
light cone.
Isn't that? I love it. It's beautiful, and he has the physical the symbol of that helps represent it. But I think that's a nice, efficient way to say it, is we have this cognitive light cone around us, and it's not set out of arrogance. But like I said, I think we're the only people that give a crap about going to Mars, or the only living.
I think that's in my abstract where I say we are made very intelligent through language, but our self-consciousness is also a prison in a sense too. It stops us from using our senses the way a happy animal does. It's so nice on a hike or when you're sitting under the stars quiet and your mind stops henpecking and you just sigh and sit, So it is, we probably can't escape the sense of self ever, according to Kassir. But I think we can in times of crisis, maybe moments of inspiration, when we forget ourselves, as we say, and we may not remember it so well. They say mystical experiences happen, and someone says, "Wow, what happened?" I don't know, but I liked it.
Yeah,
and so
it's ineffable.
Yeah, it's literally ineffable. You can't remember the details, but actually, I have some of those experiences from the '60s. Yeah. You can't remember the details, but something wonderful has happened, and it's still kind of echoing.
Yeah. And I love to delve into the 13th century was such a rich time for Sufi mystics and Beguine mystics, and all these people were having, informed by Platonism or Neoplatonism. But what they speak
you were
to,
in another life then, eh?
Yeah. Or that, whatever. If intelligence is ubiquitous, then maybe it permeates, or it's got a leaky membrane or something. But anyway, these guys are reporting what essentially the Buddhist monks have been chasing for since 350 BC, or BCE, is that non-dual state, that sense of getting out of your way long enough to just be in the being mode rather than in the like you said, the fret and bother modes. But I love that in the West we have that with our mystics, this mystical experience. So I'm sorry.
They do it in the East too, self-transcendence.
Right.
And some groups do self-flagellation, but that would be the Catholics.
Yeah, to get to ecstasy, they beat themselves really severely.
Well, that'll make you want to get away, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Self-denial is a method, and there's all kinds of other methods which are not really followed in most cultures. So I'm reading as much as they pretend. They usually are stuck and oriented on families. But the idea of having a mystical experience is, most people are joining others. The ancient Hindus would go into the forest, or they're supposed to. Apparently, they found a way of doing so only on weekends, a lot of the older men. So who knows what they did, probably met at the lodge. But this is a nice segue into the origin of myth.
Right.
What we're talking about, because the stuff that really got me excited was reading about, well, where did language come from? Where did our human form of consciousness come from? And of course, I looked at myth. And even the neuroscientists and biologists seem to agree it happened pretty suddenly. There's controversy here, plenty of it. But it happened pretty suddenly. People like Julia Kristeva, people like that, say language, because it represents, cannot do so a bit at a time. You must have a whole language. You must have a whole language to make words have meaning. So language, to have meaning, could not have appeared gradually, word by word buildup. It must suddenly have come into being. And there are sections in my paper on that too. It must relatively suddenly, maybe generations. And it seems to have done so, as you pointed out in our last conversation. The rise of the symbolic appeared vaguely here and there as islands of symbolism, but there was no culture form that lasted generations. There's no sign of more of them around, of it being carried on. They were either wiped out or it just wasn't useful. So those are anomalies. For the symbolic crossing to take place, it has to become part of the culture over generations, until the shared ideas become concretized. What shared ideas? Well, as that little piece on myth I gave you, are the speakings of the gods. Now, I'm not being literal, but the speakings of the gods were when they first had a proto-language before they were sapiens. They developed a gestural, a pointing language, probably guttural sounds, all very good for direction and naming. The women may have gossiped a little bit, but mainly pointing, and the hunters may have hunted. But such a proto-language was enough to learn the template for tools, to carry on, to make them different from all other animals. And that could be millions of years ago, because it went on for millions of years. But what would cause that sudden change of the leap into cognition and language and myth, assuming there, I can't prove that there was one, but according to my speculation, you know what an existential crisis is? I'm sure you do.
I have them once in a while just for sport. Yeah. Just to stay on top of things.
It always keeps life interesting when you can't face another day because you don't know what existence is for. Well, that's the individual existential crisis, and I'm not going to cite any origins. But what if humanity had an existential crisis? And I don't just mean bigger cats or wildebeests or bison, whatever they faced. And the brain scientists say the growth of the brain happened at a particular period, like 150,000 years, enormously. And people had an advancing proto-language, likely among the ones they call Homo erectus, who did communicate, who did travel across continents. They must have had some basic form, advanced symbolism, not a language that can converse, but enough to get by, enough to know that there was a yesterday and that there's a tomorrow. And they got to do some short-term planning. As they get better at that, they extend their foreknowledge. Can you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
As they keep extending their foreknowledge, they suddenly begin to notice things like, dear leader dies, my baby dies, Uncle Bob dies. Uh-oh, I'm going to die.
Yeah. Ding.
So they get this sense of mortal knowledge. And it probably wasn't discussed, but they began to bury their dead, or at least get them out of the way. And the sense of mortal knowledge to an animal that is striving every day just to survive and procreate could create an existential crisis. They say, like among the existentialists of the 40s, they say life has no meaning, so why live? And the answer is, of course, well, why not? As I believe it was Camus once said, shall I die or shall I go for a coffee?
Yeah.
Because to live on for the existentialist in a meaningless world was, in a sense, to create meaning.
Yeah. Existence precedes essence.
Yes, to create meaning, because they're living for the sake of living. And most of them were quite indulgent about it, at least is my picture. So way back in time here, when the existential crisis hits, there must have been a malaise, a huge lack of will to keep struggling on when especially if you experienced a major catastrophe, say your tribe mates all began to die, or they did. And this kind of despair might spread, but we can't live that way. So it's not going to be mind over. Something must have responded, and that's what I'm suggesting. That spontaneously, they began to, in their fear and awe, and their knowledge of nature, their intimate knowledge of nature, the wind in the trees, the sound of the streams, the crackling of the northern lights. Some say it crackles. They could hear the voices of the gods. Gods weren't specified, but they could hear the voices of the gods. And we'll say at night around that circular sacred campfire, they together worked out ways of saying what they thought they were hearing. They began to create myths of origin. myth of the origin of death. I can only imagine it being a severe struggle, but it wasn't like there was an individual author. It was like they were struggling. They're like ancient Mormons in a way. They get a new revelation and they tell everybody, and then they're the one in power.
Yeah.
So I hope that wasn't in bad taste.
Well, to any Mormons out there, it's okay. Yeah,
it's okay.
I'm a heathen,
I have friends who are Mormons.
Yeah, and I'm a godless heathen, so you can yell at me for that versus him saying that.
So the response to, look, a paper. The great Mircea Eliade said, it is impossible to imagine how consciousness could appear without conferring a meaning on man's impulses and experiences. Consciousness of a real and meaningful world is intimately linked with the discovery of the sacred. How can they deal with meaninglessness? They talk about it. They create tales, and in doing so, they awaken to the sacred. Now, was ist the sacred? Huh? Yeah, that's a tough one. Well, I'm not a spiritualist or anything like that, but when they began to talk, they used their imaginations, so they became aware that there are places beyond the hills. There are places far away that they are not aware of, and there are places even further than that. There may be a land after death. There may be a land out of sight above, and there might be one below. And most important, there was a time of origins when everything was perfect. And there's a time yet to come. These were like the discovery of imaginary worlds, which to them were real because they were talking about them. So, that the sacred is nothing more than what we in our scientific age call the world, but we don't have the awe. We don't have the awe anymore because it's become all objective world, and yet we deal constantly with places that don't exist right before us. So I would say myth was a response to the sacred crisis that led to the mythic mind and awareness of the sacred, and they began to live in the sacred by all records, with all the statues and cave painting, and they walked about in new worlds realized, to twist an old saying. Walter Otto, classicist from the 30s, in a way that is almost lost to us, supersensory images of the sacred, by whose vision man was overcome, must have produced ecstasy, devotion, allegiance, and exaltation, a need for meaning that ritual and myth, if not fulfilled, at least assuaged. So they went on, and the mythic mind went on for a long time, not as long as the pre-mythic mind. Have you heard of Merlin Donald and his 3 stages?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
He's from the 90s. Oh, he's quite famous. He said there was the episodic mind, which is what most animals have, right in the present.
Right.
And then there's the mythic mind, stages in between, of course. And the mythic mind is when we lived, we still knew cause and effect from working with our hands. But when it came to the big questions, why did the rain come or didn't, or why did the volcano explode? That's the gods. And of course, the gods must be appeased and appealed to, and that's why we invent royalty and priests who make sure we keep worshiping those gods, because that's keeping them in power. And the mythic age was like that for a long time. People have accused them of making up the gods to keep themselves in power. I think they probably thought the gods were real too. Because they experienced them. That which causes experience is not to be doubted. And they lived in a different world than we do. It's lucky for them in many ways, because I think they felt much more alive. Not in our deterministic world of prediction.
Yeah.
Much more alive, but just as nasty and deadly as we are.
Oh, of course, of course. And that was, and I confessed to you earlier, I'm only about halfway through that publication, but my takeaway thus far is that there was a category of mindedness, or we could say consciousness, that you seem to present in this article that never occurred to me before. That there, and it is the mythic mind, is what I'm referring to. But I see it in an evolutionary and just a daily cognitive way, like you just described. That it is something we don't have access to anymore. The veil's been pulled back, and all. We see the wiring under the board, and it's every the Enlightenment project and empiricism, all this kind of stuff, kind of took the fun away from mythos. But I tried to put myself into that for a moment and thinking about that just being, again, another category. So in other words, in the 4 Ps of cognition, it was very perceptual, very participatory, whereas now we're more propositional and procedural. And so there was an emphasis on that. And I've heard other people say that in the axial age, the sense of I-ness became more reified, whereas before it was less I-ness and more like the thing you had sent from Frankfurt.
Very true.
I thou, and then the it thou, and the it thou was very recent, but the I thou was this relationship, this relationality that you were referring to.
I tend to think that even the kings and the warriors weren't as egotistic as we are on a daily basis. I mean, they really believe that I can mollify the gods. Mervyn Donald's final stage he called the thematic, which is like procedural, and it began as our modes of communication changed, as you can imagine. First, writing in the form of glyphs, and then later on the printing press, and each stage of communication changes the group mind and focuses it more externally until the objective world, freakishly, becomes assumed to be the only reality. We become outside-in creatures instead of inside-out. And, when that began to happen back with Galileo, great as he was, when we began to see that the outside world, which we've made up from the inside world, causes the inside world. In other words, the objective point of view becomes accepted as real. That's been a big mistake, but there's been a strong kind of a reaction against it, I think. Like phenomenology and things like that, which are very important to understanding that our subjectivity is imbued in the objectivity, and it could be no other way, because each one needs the other. You can't have an objective world unless there's a subjectivity to participate in it.
Yeah.
And you can't have a subjectivity unless you objectify yourself enough to say, hey, that's a me. And I'm suggesting in the mythic mind, those two were not distinctly separated. There were still manipulators and things like that.
But there's a Coxeye professor at Toronto, and he calls that transjectivity. I love that word that I don't think he coined it. Maybe he did. I don't know. But transjectivity, as opposed to the subject-object relation, that there is the relationality going there, which and we'll bring Whitehead in a little bit. But yeah, that speaks to process and relation and things like that, I think. I was going to add, do you want to go ahead and talk about Whitehead a little bit? Because I know you've mentioned him to me, and then there's an interview you have on YouTube where you speak to it a little bit.
I'm a little annoyed right now at a certain philosopher named Goff, who is explaining. He's writing in Wikipedia, and he's writing in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and he defines pan-experientialism as conscious experience all the way down. And if that sounds familiar, it's because it's the same thing as consciousness. It's consciousness all the way down. Like calling it conscious experience, that doesn't change a thing. I've talked to him about it, or sent him a message, and he says, well, no, it's in philosophy now, it's accepted. It's a convention that experience and consciousness are the same thing. And so pan-experientialism doesn't, he doesn't seem to realize that it has a long background. James and Peirce.
Those who informed Whitehead, yeah.
And Whitehead himself never used the term pan-experientialism. But for Whitehead, I don't have the quote here, he says, consciousness is only the apex of experience, one that it becomes visible, whereas experience extends well down beyond the person, beyond the animal. For Whitehead, only humans, in that same outdated definition of consciousness, are conscious. So people like Griffin, who made up the term pan-experientialism, meant it to mean beyond consciousness. And then we get people like Chalmers making up lovely words like pan-protopsychism.
Okay.
Which means exactly the same thing as non-conscious experience or pre-conscious experience.
Okay.
And Michael Ty is suggesting consciousness X, which is even beyond phenomenal consciousness. It has no attributes at all.
Okay.
So that would be like what I mean by experience in itself.
Okay.
There's probably something beyond that too, though, because experience means going out, doing something, dynamism. And so I'd suggest that there might be the big speculation of nothing, of the great nothing that many people around the world and now quantum physicists are talking about, the nothing that is everything. Yeah. The quantum vacuum, even elicited as a state of consciousness by some deep meditators, which they say goes beyond death. Now, that's speculation that I don't know anything about. I can't remember what it was like before I was born. So can't bring that in as evidence. Damn.
Yeah, right. Inadmissible. Well, I love the union of opposites when you talk about the everything and the nothing being basically the same thing. I mean, it sounds Buddhist koan, but I can reconcile it. Because when you have everything, you have nothing, because there is nothing distinct from the everything. And that may be me just blowing gas, but it makes sense in a certain context.
It's present in science, and it's present in philosophy, and it's present in theology. Void consciousness. When the phenomenologists say that all consciousness is intentional, this belies that. This is, can you imagine taking away your senses one by one, and then your thoughts, until there's no content of consciousness at all? But it might sound horrifying, you're still aware. But you're aware of nothing. Yeah. You still have a sense. It's very hard to imagine, and I'm cheating because it's not logical. But to be aware and be aware of nothing would be that zero energy state, so ZPE even. The void consciousness is to be aware. No. Now my mind's picking up steam here. Is to be aware in a timeless, empty state, which sounds to us frightening, but is said to be blissful. Yeah. From those who've been there and come back. Maybe we'll find out someday, and it certainly would then exceed life. There is it's called Thokdom, a state of consciousness achieved by deep meditating Tibetan monks. When they're going to die, they go into deep meditation, the death meditation, and they achieve Thukdom, which is that empty state. And then the body dies. But it doesn't decay for days or weeks, and this has been scientifically verified. There seems to be a little warmth around the heart. There's no brain activity. And no, I didn't witness it, but it's Michael Ty, even the analytic philosopher, talks about it.
Sounds like torpor a little bit. I don't know if humans can do that physiologically, but when hummingbirds go into torpor and they just sort of hang off a branch for a few hours to give that poor little heart of theirs a break. Well, everything slows way down. So
these Buddhist monks are dead of They have no heartbeat.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe not torpor then.
It's one step beyond, as
Mm.
a TV show might say.
Yeah, that was a good show.
And it's one step beyond life. But even some say that the longest was like 2-3 weeks
Wow.
in southern India. So it can't be explained away as a cool, dry climate,
You
as
know,
many scientists have done.
that
And
I
my
mentioned.
only point is about zero, is about nothingness.
Yeah, yeah, but it's got my little gears turning, and I was gushing about Michael Levin earlier, and it's like this is a union of cells. This is a construction of many singular agential micro entity, whatever animalcules or whatever you want to call it, this composite of cells. And so this larger agential capacity is gone, and maybe the heart's not beating, but is so I'd like to know, in that state that former person is in, is there metabolism occurring in any of the cells? Is there anything still going on
Yes.
in the body
Must be, eh?
I don't. Yeah,
At the start.
it's worth a stab, so to say. I don't know, but that would be. I'm trying to come up with reasonable ideas about what's going on. And again, when
A
Mike
healthy skepticism.
well,
Yes.
yeah, but nonetheless fascinating and amazing, because that is an we can infer from that perhaps that this isn't the cat's meow. It is
That's
while we're animated, and yeah.
That's the only point that we get, because after a week or after several months, there's a record, that stops. And the monk dies fully.
Mm.
Where does he go? Because it's usually he, but not always. Where do they go? I don't know. It's like the near-death experience. It tells us so much, but the person didn't really die.
Right.
So it doesn't tell us everything. It only tells us about, what about at the near-death experience when they're being drawn toward the light and damned are called back? What about when they reach the light?
Yeah.
They might be dead from our point of view anyway. So it doesn't really prove survival after death. And the very word there is a contradiction.
Yeah.
A little bit off topic, but you can see.
Well, it's romantic. It gives it's a sense making, or perhaps to defeat some sort of existential crisis. It gives you that satisfaction, maybe, to say, oh, okay, well, I won't fear death, because I just don't want to suffer before I die, but I could care less about dying.
Well, you know who you sound like now. You sound like one of them mythic people who've just discovered the existential crisis. There must be something.
I want nothing for myself. Other people can go to whatever their afterlife they conceive of, but I want to flatline and disappear. I don't want to be me after that. I don't have any say in it. But
whose name I won't mention, and he's a scholar now, but he was once a Mennonite, and he left the church, and so he says, "Oh, gee, oblivion sounds good."
Yeah,
because he has a deep fear of hell.
Oh, okay,
yeah, psychological sense.
Okay.
Because he's left the church, and he says he doesn't believe, but it's still been put in him that if you leave the church, you're going to hell.
Oh, that's too bad. That's too bad.
Yeah, it is too bad.
Yeah. No,
but oblivion often sounds great. Just think in life, what's some of our favorite times of the day when we turn off, when we finally crash.
The most fantastical speculation I would want to entertain is that the experience that this person had was for something, and that's as far as I'll leave it. So some people talk about Akashic records and retention of this and that. Okay, that sounds neat, but to me it's still a little too fantastic. But just that you and I, as experiential agents, in the suffering, that it was perhaps not pure nihilism. That which is, if we go into thinking that maybe all of this is self-organizing and autopoietic and iterative and all these things, that it advanced itself, like Whitehead says, in his schema, or his scheme rather, that there is a satisfaction in the concrescence of the actual occasion to frame by frame by frame create what we call the future becoming now.
Achieve satisfaction and perish.
That satisfaction, it's one thing I like about Whitehead, and you said in your interview that you're not a proselyte for Whiteheadian thinking, but that's a very romantic and lovely thought, that satisfaction that occurs both while we're living and then when we check out, that satisfaction is a perished object and it is somewhere there in whatever that we would probably never have access to or intellectually. So anyway, that's my closest thing I ever get to aspiration for an afterlife.
When the point of experience perishes, it apparently then becomes an object, part of the eternal object world.
Yeah.
So
it reifies.
Does precede it, and as to your point, it contributes to the greater reality. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think of the lines from T.S. Eliot, and when all our exploring is over, we will return to the place from which we came for the first time, which seems ironic and impossible. If we've been there, how can it be the first time? And obviously there's only two ways. One is if you've changed, so the experience is new, or your life experience has changed the source. Which is sort of what you're saying. It matters in that sense because, or maybe it's a matter of memory. Some people, as the heart surgeon said, when they die, their brain activity just drops. And about 50% of the people, just before they die, their brain activity really winds up like a like a takeoff.
Yeah.
And so I'm tying that into memory. If you can die and retain your memory, maybe you change the source. Maybe you keep your record in the Akashic record. This is a metaphoric speaking.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. But no, that's as wishful thinking as I would myself, and I don't care. I would never impose on anyone else. But that's what I entertain. That this experience, all of the frames of experience that this agent had, are behind me. And so, and in an abstract sense, you and I have been spent 45 minutes so far talking about historical persons, be they anonymous or we bring up names. And I love that kind of mindedness, that the mindedness is trans-temporal or whatever, that it's moving with us. And so we bring the memories of Plato and Whitehead and all the Henri Bergson and all, speaking of time, bringing all that forward with us in keeping it somewhat alive in an abstract sense by reissuing the thoughts and letting those thoughts create new outcomes or whatever, new speculation. So I like that too.
Another hot word with Whitehead is teleology. And also brought back by Thomas Nagel not long ago in his great 2012 book on evolution, natural teleology, not biblical or God.
Top down, yeah.
A natural teleology, because it does seem, and I know you've experienced this, I can just pick it up, that sometimes we feel ourselves drawn for something when we don't know what, like having a conversation. My planning went way out the window, but we're being drawn on by something that's invisible from here. And Whitehead believed in that, and I think there is that kind of thing which we can latch onto or step away from. But experience in life does seem to matter somehow. How do we keep picking ourselves up from so many little failures each day? Because we feel we have a purpose.
Yeah.
As minuscule as it may be. So I like Whitehead for that reason, is that he puts raw experience first. He puts creativity first.
Yeah.
But the way he uses the word God has always deeply confused me. And most of his interpreters has said, well, he just used the most available word for a mystery. He puts God in three forms. He doesn't mean God the Father. Although there are people who take him that way.
Yeah, there's theology branches from his.
Yeah, yes, there are, and that's mainly a travesty because Whitehead himself was probably an agnostic through and through, brought up through the mathematics.
Right.
One book claims him. Oh, I know what I want to get back to. One book claims him as a empiricist, just like Bacon and all. And he's not an empiricist. He becomes an idealist when he says everything is pure mathematics. And his philosophy, unlike the way the fellow I was mentioning puts it, is that experience is first. Experience is always happening. Only thing that may be beyond that is, the ultimate combination, the combination problem would be a universal mind, which may or may not be there, or which we may be on the way toward, or may be a fantasy. But for Whitehead, experience happens without memory. It happens without a record. It's a shudder, a sensation, and it's always relational. And that implies that you don't necessarily need, people say, to have experience, you need an experiencer. Well, people say that. But if you think about it a lot, not necessarily. An experience happens in relation between two entities or two systems, or two fields, and it changes them each. And it is felt, but not like we feel and remember it and extend it, felt instantaneously. It might, if you can picture an animal, it might just happen in a tentacle without a brain. The animal has no brain, so there's no central experiencer. It's a moment of sensation caused by relation through an energy exchange. The experience simpliciter at its most basic level. And people aren't inclined toward that anymore. Ever since the Tucson conference said that experience and consciousness will be considered the same thing, to shorten. Well, it was decreed, philosophically decreed, because there was so much talk between awareness, consciousness, and an experience, that people would get hung up whole sessions on discussing it. And since there's no clear answer, I suppose it's time wasted. But people like Goff took that decree as being a philosophic convention. You can't talk about experience because it simply means consciousness. It didn't used to. It didn't used to. Not for William James. Not for Peirce.
Yeah, because experience is almost more of a pure relationality versus consciousness, which is an interpretation, perhaps a phenomenological reporting of that, or not necessarily phenomenological. So it's a reporting of that experience. So maybe they
like
correlate.
A secondary item, right?
Yeah, they can correlate, item. But yeah, experience can be, like you said, and that can be. So there's quantum Bayesianism, and there's Friston's up, and this is not fair for me to bring this in to this context, but when you were talking, I was thinking of updating of priors, like with Bayesian calculus, where an experiential agent, whether it is a human or a single cell, or maybe systems that are organizing, that things are being, error correction is occurring. They find error correction in all levels of physics.
Right.
So that error correction is a kind of Bayesian calculus that it's moving in a way that it can, whatever what its goal directedness is. So yeah, I'm with you on that we may, so for them, maybe they can bracket that and call it experience / consciousness. But I like what you're doing, and let's keep them in categories for a
moment. Call it phenomenal consciousness if you wish, and are careful how you define it.
Yeah.
But it has no qualities. I like the way you put that, and I'm not even going to open the difficult area of quantum physics, because there are quantum field exchanges that do seem to learn to change. I mean, even among animals, we know that a slime mold will change direction and remember that direction. Yeah. Yet I don't think that's consciousness. It's physiological learning.
Yeah, it's intelligence. Is maybe or experience and frame by frame experience,
basic behaviorism,
updating itself. Yeah. I had a young lady on. She was getting her PhD MD at UC San Francisco. Her name was Deepa Rajan, and she was working on Stentor cerealis. It's an animalcule, a single-celled animal. But she was teaching habituation to these single-celled organisms with a fear stimulus of light, vibration, but she, for short periods of times, she could habituate these single cells to have responses, not just to the fear response to vibration, but I think there were other things that she was demonstrating. But that speaks to this, okay, so does this single cell have the qualia, the inner life experience, right, or is it an experiential intelligence, a quanta of intelligence there that is relating to its environment, and so I loved her work. It was and Mike Levin's all about that too. He did the slime mold thing, and he does weird things with a single skin cell of a frog, or a group of skin cells from a frog, and with a little bit of ion channel calcium manipulation, that he can get these single batches of wild type skin cells to have motility and apparent trainability. So it's showing up again on what he would call a scale invariant system of intelligence.
We're having an interesting conversation, an exchange of words, and yet
We're
it
going
keeps
all over
striking me that the paucity of words can never quite exceed themselves. Where we'd like them. There's too many ways to say the same thing and too many perspectives. If there was a way to just show it or experience, maybe AI will do that.
Yes, let that
it seems to me what you said really early on, that the mythic mind has disappeared, isn't quite accurate. The mythic mind are the assumptions about reality.
Yeah.
The unconscious, you might call it, or worldview, the unconscious worldview, and they certainly still exist today. And I might suggest that every institution is mythic. Because we have language, myths, assumptions are always present and not always recognized. It may be myths that keep us from understanding each other, because we learn them so early before we even master language. So myth is still active today, and often in negative ways. Maybe even too much ideological hope is a kind of a myth too.
Yeah.
So myth is present. It's gone underground, like as Jung said about the gods.
Yeah.
It's become symptoms.
Well, you're inspiring me to ask you, and I want to have you back for another conversation. But this is something that was in the back of my head when we were beginning this conversation. Is where is mythos now, and how is it manifesting itself, and where is it moving with us in future, prognosticating the future? And one thing that I think of is there's something, so in our era of social media, and I'm going to invoke Baudrillard, and we're, younger generations are sort of merging into a hyper reality with these iterations or abstractions away from concreteness. And you and I are doing it right now. We're on a Zoom call. We're sort of in a simulacra of sorts. There's two people talking, but I wonder where mythological. So there's a professor that talks about prophilicity, where we are generating avatars of ourselves that become very much reified in the social media commons and the ecosystem. So that could be a whole conversation down the road, perhaps, is to look forward about mythos. Yeah. And how is it manifesting for future generations, or what will
building an identity is based upon mythic principles.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you where myth isn't today, in our beloved costumed superheroes and that kind of thing. That's not myth at all. That's just ego fantasies of identity. They steal themes from myth and they steal characters, but it's not mythic because it's 100% conscious, 100% meant to be sold and manipulated. I used to love reading comics, but I can't stand costume hero movies. They're just too silly.
Yeah.
Where does myth really live? It lives in our politics. It lives in our economics. It lives in our daily relationships. Like I say, it's all our unconscious expectations and fears which guide our quirky behavior. And if we could address it at a deeper level, it could, well, to jump right to it, it could save the world, because we are living by myth now, at least the right wing, if I can mislabel them all, who believe that we must continue exploiting nature, who believe that when there's a conflict and you can't convince someone, then you should shoot them. I really think we are partially at mythic warfare right now. And Joe Campbell, again, at least said, when he was asked, what is future myth going to look like? He says, well, I don't know, but it's going to have something to do with the whole planet. And I thought that's so obvious. That's true. We
And
have to expand our consciousness to include everyone else.
yeah, yeah. And in the age of individualism, we have to do a course correction to get that. And I was thinking, along with mythos, since in the West religion is waning off, that we have civil religions emerging, and there is a full mythos in each of those religions.
Ideology has become
yeah, exactly right. And so you're pointing it out in the neoliberal mythos of that's been going strong for 70 something years, that the land is ours, that and we must conquer and extract and all these kind of
what
things.
climate change? It's all a hoax by the government to
Yeah,
tax
because that
us to death.
interrupts the hydrocarbon fuel industry's profit margins and all these. So yeah, you have to construct
That one really pisses me off, because I had to stay away from my property for a month and a half because of forest fires all around.
Oh yeah. And I'm in my mid 50s, so I'll be dead before the real shit hits the fan. And so but I have to have a sense of ownership for the future generations, that whatever it is that we're doing wrong now, I will aspire to help, speak to the idea that we can be a little better in stewarding the future for people who are just being born right now, and their children and their grandchildren, that and there's this long-termism movement that's coming up, and hopefully that doesn't get warped, but you have to think that way. You have to think that
well, in general, I'm kind of a fatalist, so I don't spend time worrying about it, because I know it's going to happen.
right
expect the worst, but at the same time, it's come on way faster than the skeptics had predicted. When they say, come on, there's always been climate change. Yeah, but it hasn't happened. It's happened in thousands of years, not hundreds or decades.
Yeah.
And they're missing that point, but I don't want to get into social causes right now.
Yeah.
Let's stay in the safe abstract.
Yeah, exactly. But it's
there are myths involved. There are different two ideologies involved.
Yeah.
And one is very short-term and selfish. Not that I'm going to tell you which side I'm on.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. But
just did.
Well, of course, yeah, that's why. But it's like, yeah, I just want to keep going back to that that we live in this decade, and what we do in this decade reverberates strongly into future decades, and that sense of ethos. And I'm not a moralist. I don't believe morality doesn't really mean much to me, but this strong sense of compassion for those who haven't been born, and the what we're handing off, it to me seems to be drowned out, that impulse to preserve or rethink how we consume, or why we consume, or what we consume. These are incontrovertible questions, in my opinion. And market systems aside, what are we doing for the future of this species? That to me is how I would counter somebody who would come on and grumble in the comment section about climate change is bullshit. Well, okay, fine, whatever. But if things we're doing now,
the species may
continue,
limiting.
Yeah, the continuity of our species. So my steel man back to you, sir, or ma'am, that the species is of no importance to you, because it is not a case closed on either side, if that's how you want to argue it. So you don't care. And that's kind of a polemical response, but it's like, where's your concern?
We have droplets of consciousness.
Yeah,
there's some
drops of experience.
Yeah. What do you think of the idea of that the planet itself is in some way experiencing? I won't say conscious.
Mm-hmm.
It's experiencing as a whole unit.
Mm-hmm.
I've read a bit about it and I fancy it, but I'm not a scientist. I don't know. But certainly with the mycelium network and how it adapts to change and crisis, it does seem to be like an entity, a being.
Mm-hmm. Well,
maybe not conscious like a god, just an experiencing being trying to self-preserve.
Exactly. And the scant surface of a few hundred meters of the Earth's surface is very much alive everywhere. I mean, there's nowhere on this Earth that's necessarily in any scale devoid of life. There are deserts, but there's still stuff going on. So yeah, I mean, on the surface, it is a living organism. So we'll go back to Frankfurt's it-thou distinction. It's constitutive of what we would allegedly call inanimate
material.
but the living things, the microorganisms all the way up to megafauna and megaflora, are interacting with that, and they're relating with it, and they're benefiting from it, and they're being kept in check by it. But it's a system that is at least 50% alive, and we can't even define life and intelligence in a way that would fit to this system. So
in that sense, it's not just your life that when you end, you won't be here to see the disasters, because you'll still be here.
The elements will be here, yeah.
And somehow you're engaged. I mean, there's no getting off the earth, as they'll find out eventually when they try to colonize Mars.
You can't live there long. It doesn't have a molten core to keep. It's not like here. The core is solid as far as I know in Mars, and I've read it. It's because I'm curious.
We are of the Earth,
and
we can send robots out, but it's silly to bother sending people to such a totally hostile environment.
Yeah,
I'd be very shocked if they find one microbe alive or once alive on Mars.
Yeah, well, again, we rely on our liquid mantle and the magnetic poles for, and not to get too crazy about EM, but we need some of that to be who we are, or to be a system of living organisms. And when you get on Mars, it's a solid chunk of cold rock at this point. I believe there's very insignificant or none in the center. And they said that's one of the things that will prevent long-term colonization. You could go there for a few months and do your thing, but I don't think we could live there that long because of that very subtle electromagnetic thing that's going on, the toroid cage or whatever. And I'm not trying to get into weird new age shit. It's just
you saw what it did to Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Well, there you go.
And he went outside in his Mars movie.
There you go. It's been proof of concept. So, well, Dr. Nixon, I think we've given them enough to chew on. We've been talking for a little over an hour, and I do want you back. And so
it was spontaneous.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I appreciate you speaking with me in that sense, that, it wasn't just a dry question and answer kind of thing, that you were willing to just flow in a conversation. So I very much appreciate that. And hopefully the audience appreciated that. But I would love to have you back. Maybe after the holiday things die off, we can maybe look at February. I can bring you back, or late January. So
it's about a birth,
Yeah. And in birth, we'll talk about the future and what the future holds.
I'd like that
Not
very
necessarily
much.
for 2024, but for maybe the next century. Who knows? If there's any. I always say, if we don't irradiate the planet through all the wonderful nuclear weapons that we have, that the primitive cultures are just fine. The people living in the Amazon and sub-Saharan Africa, the tribal folks in New Guinea, they'll be okay. So the species is going to be fine, but how do we keep what we have now in the Western sensibility and what we do?
The planet cannot sustain this increasing growth of population. Exactly. Never mind the other devastations that are brought out by the population.
Yeah.
It's so obvious, I don't worry about it. I'm watching it happen.
Yeah. It's like the plane can crash different ways. That's the way I look at it. There's different ways for the plane to hit the mountain, and maybe the angle of attack might be just enough. Some of this Western stuff might survive, but my consolation is knowing that, again, if we don't nuke the place, that there will be people on this planet who are already working very well in harmony with nature, and they know how to get by, and they'll be okay. Everything will be reset 10,000 years, but it's okay.
Turn my power off. I not only won't have air conditioning when it gets to be 130 degrees, but I won't have the net for our next conversation.
I know. So we need to think positive and hope that at least don't collapse until February. And we get one more conversation out.
It's my birthday.
Oh, there you go. Well, Dr. Nixon, I again, it's been an honor and a pleasure to have you on for a conversation. I'm glad we were able to get together, and we'll plan on a second one. So I'll say goodbye to you after we stop the recording. But to the YouTube audience, very much appreciate your attention and
let me say goodbye to them too.
Yes, please.
Goodbye, YouTube audience. And I'd like to note that my host is very quick and very knowledgeable, and I enjoyed the encounter a lot.
Oh. Well, bless you, sir. Thank you for that. I try to be a good host to my guests. So. I thank you. I thank you for that. So, all right. So we'll say our goodbyes after I stop the record. But again, thanks, YouTube. Bye-bye.